but let's see. Yeah, we'll start recording this meeting. And again, my name is Russell Koff. I'm with the Cadmus Jacobs Partnership, and I'm joined with my team here that we'll introduce in a second. And this is our sixth and final digital workshop as part of our FEMA grant writing training series across Tennessee. And we're going to focus today on grant administration. And so our agenda for today's discussion is here on the screen. So we'll start off with some introductions, kind of summarize where we've been so far and some of the topics that we have discussed. And we will do a participant poll. So I know some of you have attended previous digital workshops in our series. And so we've got a little bit of an interactive poll exercise that we'll step through to just kind of gauge where everybody, the organization that you're with and what your experience is with grant administration. And then, yeah, Anna and our team will, excuse me, spend a few minutes kind of setting the stage for today's conversation, talking about why grant administration is important to your overall grant pursuit efforts and to your organization and community's success in receiving grant funding. And then the fourth item there is really the things you need to know for grant administration really before you submit an application. So how you can work to prepare your organization to receive grant funding. And then we'll transition a bit to once your project gets rolling and is underway and your grant is executed, what are a number of the grant administration and compliance things that you'll need to stay in line with. We will take like a 5-minute stretch break just to give everybody a chance to kind of stand up and get a snack or whatever. We do have 2 hours today, so we'll go until 4 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Central. But after the break, we'll pick up with grant closeout and audit. So sort of after the grant project is finished, what are the key things to know there? And then we'll finish with some takeaways, best practices, and Q&A. I think we'll have a good amount of time if there are individual questions from folks or just people who want to stick around and dive into some more details, then we'd be absolutely happy to do that towards the end of today's discussion. So before we go on to introduce our team, I know many of you have joined us for the previous digital workshops, but if there are new folks and if you're new to this Teams environment, we've gone ahead and just muted everybody on the call so that there's less background noise, but you're welcome to raise your hand and come off mute and ask a question throughout the presentation. The other thing to note is that there is a chat, and so if you look at the top of the screen, there's a little chat button kind of bubble up there that says chat. And that'll open up a window. You can also type in a question there. And then next to that also is the raise hand button. I will say that, yeah, this presentation is being recorded, and we will send out the recording shortly after this presentation, along with the recordings from the other sessions that we've done in this series. And we also will send out the slides. So you'll have all the slides that we will be walking through here today. And it looks like Trevor has his hand raised. Trevor, I don't know if you have a question for us right off the top. Be happy to hear from you. Oh, just looks like you took your hand down. So that's okay. That's how the hand feature works. So feel free to raise your hand in the future if there's anything that you want to ask as we go through this. Okay, well, yeah, on the next slide, we'll just go ahead and introduce our team who will be speaking to you today. So as I mentioned, my name is Russell Koff. I'm part of the Cadmus Jacobs team that's supporting FEMA and TEMA on this entire series of in-person workshops and digital workshops. I'm based in Colorado, and I lead the infrastructure funding and grants practice at Jacobs. So we're a global consultancy, and the team that I work on is a national group that works across the country in communities, large and small, to help them strategize around federal, state, and nonprofit grant opportunities, and then ultimately to prepare applications, benefit cost analyses, all those sorts of things that go into delivering a competitive grant application. And then we also work side by side with communities on grant administration, our topic today. So Anna will say more about this, but it's definitely an important topic, and one that isn't, I'll admit, the most exciting always, but really important to get that right. And nobody wants to go through all the effort of putting together a successful grant application only to kind of not be able to comply with the requirements and have your funding put at risk. So really look forward to sharing some of our experience and tips with all of you today, and also hearing from all of you about some of the things that you've encountered, if you have experience with grant administration, and some of the questions that you have. So we really look forward to the next few hours of this discussion and having a really productive session today. So with that, I'll pass it to my colleague Ellen to introduce herself.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. Hi, everyone. My name is Ellen Roussel. I'm also part of the Cadmus Jacobs team supporting TEMA and FEMA with the in-person and digital sessions. So any of you who were in person, maybe we've met before. I am also part of the infrastructure funding grants team at Jacobs that Russell just described. I'm based in New York and looking forward to today's session. So thank you for having me. I'll pass it to Anna to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I work with Russell and Ellen, and I attended the Nashville and then also the Johnsonville weeks. So perhaps we met also in person. And then I'm a grant consultant and also transportation planner by trade. Passing it on to Ray.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. Raymond Bibla, Grants Project Specialist with Cadmus Jacobs. I am going to be running the Mentimeter poll today. So you may recognize me from a couple in-person sessions and all of the digital sessions. Thank you for being here at our very last digital session. Excited to have you here. Go back to you, Russell.
Okay, great. Well, just a few words on kind of why we're here, especially for folks that maybe this is your first session with us today. So yeah, FEMA and TEMA are putting on this series of workshops in person and digital. I'll say a few more words about that in a minute. But basically, yeah, as we all know, the number of disasters and the costs of those disasters has been going up and up and up. We have more people living in our communities. And so FEMA and TEMA and all of their partners are really motivated to do more in the area of disaster response and acknowledge that the recovery effort does not just end after disaster cleanup and individual assistance needs are met. And we understand that communities just have really tremendous needs after a disaster to really build back better than before, and kind of incorporate resilience and mitigate future disasters as part of the rebuilding process. And so we understand that all of those efforts cost a lot of money, right? And so even with federal resources, it's oftentimes not enough from FEMA. And so that's kind of the origin of this effort. And FEMA and TEMA heard from communities across Tennessee and other communities across the nation that pursuing grants of all types, whether it's FEMA post-disaster grants, other grant programs from across the federal government, and then even philanthropic corporate grants, can all play a really important part of helping communities that have been impacted by disasters and other communities for that matter to just be more prepared to have stronger community assets ahead of disasters. So that was the impetus for this training to really build capacity across the state of Tennessee and to reach as many communities as we could in equipping all of you with the tools to help understand what grant programs are out there, really work to develop competitive, compliant grant applications that are ultimately successful. And the last bit is kind of what we're talking about here today in detail is on the grant administration side, and to make sure that that part of the process is not overlooked, as it's really important. So also want to acknowledge we do have our partners from FEMA and TEMA on the call here too, including Melanie Smith, who's coordinated all of the invitations and things. So very thankful for them, and glad that we're kind of at the finish line here with our effort, reaching out to all of you across the state on these important topics. So on the next slide, yeah, as I mentioned, we did a series of in-person grant workshops, and then now we're here today on the last of our virtual sessions. And on the next slide, yeah, just to, I know many of you attended a number of our sessions. We were in Jackson and Memphis in December, Columbia, Nashville in January, Cookeville and Chattanooga in January, and then Knoxville in the Tri-Cities just last month. So I had a really good series of workshops, and those covered for those who attended. It was really everything we could fit into a 4-hour workshop about grants. So preparing for grants, doing research, how to kind of work with your network to identify opportunities, and then focusing on writing grant applications, what other things about data and analysis and mapping needs to go into your grant applications. And then we did spend some time talking about grant administration and those in-person workshops, but really just scratched the surface. And so we're here today to kind of dive into that further. So that's kind of to catch people up who weren't involved earlier. And what we'll do now is, now that you've met our team, we'd love to see who's in our virtual room here. And so we've got a great turnout. Looks like more than 50 people on the line. So probably too many people to all come off mute and introduce yourselves one by one. But the Mentimeter that Ray's going to discuss here in a second will give everybody an opportunity to kind of report the organization that you're from and answer some other questions that I think will be helpful for us as we get started on today's session. So Ray, you want to take it from here?
Sure. Thanks, Russell. Hi again, everybody. If you have been to any of these digital sessions, then you already know the deal with the Mentimeter. This is an online digital engagement tool that we use to understand who we're talking to and the level of grant administration knowledge that we currently have in the room. So there's a couple ways you can access this. One, if you have your cell phone handy, you can just scan the QR code and that will bring you right into the Mentimeter room. Or you can click on the link if someone is able to copy and paste that link into the chat. That would be great. Thank you, Russell. And then if at any point you are prompted for an access code, that access code is 18180258. And then as I move on to the presentation, all of this information will be also shared on the screen. So we'll just leave this up for maybe another 15 seconds. And then, Anna, if you could stop sharing, I will share my screen. You heading over to the Mentimeter. All right, so here we have the QR code still. And to join at any time, go to menti.com and again, use this code. The more the merrier, so hop right in. Pretty easy tool to use here. So the first question we have is, what organization do you represent? We would like to know who we are talking to in the room here today. And I'll probably give each question about 30 seconds. Okay. A lot of city and county government. Great to see as always. A couple NGOs. Excellent. Faith-based organizations. Excellent. Okay. Emergency management. All right, so we have a very diverse room here today. Excellent. We will try and keep our conversation as wide as possible to apply to all of you. The next question is, what type of project are you looking to advance with grant funding? This is always fun to watch. Reminds me of a horse race. Okay, we have community development in first, housing and social services close second, but it looks like we do have a full room here today. Everybody is looking for something specific, and if you did choose other, please feel free to type in chat what that is. But otherwise, it looks like we have a pretty even ground. Everybody is represented. Thank you. The next question is, what is your level of experience with grant administration? Alrighty, so mostly novice and intermediate. We do have a couple experts in the room. Always great to see. Everybody here is going to be able to learn something from this presentation today, so don't worry if you're a novice or an expert. We do have something for everybody. Thank you. Next question is, from which funding agency or organization have you received grant funding in the past, if you have received grant funding? And this is an open response, so I'll give this about 30 seconds for you to type your answers in. Okay. Tima, doing a lot of great work out here. We thank you for your work, Tima. A lot of varied responses. That's great to see. Everything from private to state to federal. Yeah, super. Okay, thank you. Just a couple more here. What are some grant administration challenges that you have faced in the past and you would like to be brought up today, if at all possible?
Yeah, and I'll just add to this, Ray, as folks are typing things in. We know that grant administration is a pretty broad area. We'll get into quite a bit of it today, but yeah, this is great to see on the screen some of your all's challenges or experiences you've had in the past. So I'm seeing reporting requirements, definitely very important. Having to send duplicate documents when there's changes, just a general lack of expertise with grant administration, some questions and requirements that aren't always clear. Having a tracking system for deliverables, yep, that's really important, whether that's a formal system or just some system that you can have at your organization to track those things. What else am I seeing here? Budget fine print. Yep, lots of fine print in grant agreements. It's not always fun to read through all that, but certainly
True.
important.
One of the most important tools you can have with budget fine print is a highlighter.
Close out again, checklist. Okay, close out. Great.
Yeah, excellent.
Okay.
And then these are saved, so we can always come back at the end. Ellen and Anna, if any of these are something that you're able to answer that maybe are not in the slides. So I can move on to the next one here. That's all right. Well, this one is very similar, but if you have any specific questions, set of challenges you faced, we can also answer those later.
Yeah, and I'd welcome folks to put in any responses here, but also as we dive into each of the sections that I shared on the agenda, we'll be taking some time throughout to kind of see if there are specific questions on these topics that we get into. So, okay.
I think this one is mostly a duplication of the last one. But we can also, speak to very specific questions here if you do have them.
Okay. Under budget with one area and over in another. Good question. Okay. Got it. Well, no, this is great to have, and like I said, we'll be pausing along the way to hopefully hear from some of you about issues you're describing here, and ways we can work to address those things in the future with your grants. So
I think
is there
that might
anything else?
be the last one. So we're all done with the Mentimeter. Thank you. We'll get to those questions throughout, and then I can pass it back to you, Anna.
Okay. Okay. So now that we have gone over like some of the Mentimeter questions and we understand your frustrations with grant administration, we wanted to dive into why is grant administration important, understanding the fact that all or the majority of us have faced issues during grant administration. We understand that it is rather complex and it is perhaps the most important part of a grant because once you actually have received that grant funding, it does take time and significant effort to actually expend those funds and then also make sure that you are reimbursed for all of the activities that you have completed and that you receive all the funds for which you seek reimbursement for. So a few things to know about why we're doing this presentation. So one is that it is crucial to ensuring that the project is funded and completed. So making sure that you actually complete all of the activities within the right criteria. So for example, if you want to seek reimbursement for something, you don't actually start doing that activity before you have the grant obligated. And then also to make sure that you actually complete those activities within the assigned period of performance. If you are unable to complete those activities within that period of performance, You can experience clawbacks because not every agency will be flexible, and it is up to them to actually decide if they're willing to extend that period of performance for you, because typically you're expected to actually be able to complete that project within the project schedule that you agree to. So if there's delays, that is typically going to be on you. However, of course, there's some exceptions, but we want to help you actually carry out that project within that period of performance to ensure that your entire project for which you received grant funding for, that you receive all those funds. And then this is also going to reflect poorly or positively on your agency in terms of future grant funding opportunities and awards, because there's a section, the project readiness section, typically in most grants, where you speak to your performance with other grant awards. However, if you don't have that experience, then hopefully you're able to speak to other agencies that you potentially partnered with, just to show that you are going to be able to carry out this grant administration successfully. So a grant life cycle itself, there's several stages. So there's the pre-award stage. Then during that stage, you receive the award package. Then pre that award package, then there's that award package that you received, and you're going to be signing the award. You're going to be obligating. This typically takes anywhere from 6 months. It can take up to 2 years, and during that time there may be administration changes, other changes that occur that could affect the success of you being able to obligate that grant. Most people and agencies are able to obligate their grants. However, there are sometimes challenges that occur, and then those result in clawbacks of funding. And then during the post-award stage, the funds become available, so you execute the project, and then, of course, you monitor and report all the activities that are expended. And then during the closeout stage, you basically work with the agency to submit all the reports that you need to do, and any outstanding issues are resolved. And then, of course, during the post closeout stage, this is the lessons learned stage. So any audits that need to occur, and then other adjustments that the awarding agency expects you to do. So some people did drop during the polling some issues that they have experienced. And here we'll cover a few other issues that make grant administration difficult. So one thing that sometimes we've noticed clients experience is that because that grant application stage is so short, we understand that NOFOs drop, and then it's typically several months, and then right away that grant application's due. So, and those NOFOs are typically rather lengthy and then quite dense. So there may have been insufficient review of those NOFO requirements, and there might be a lack of understanding of all the requirements that are required during if those grant funds are awarded. So we often recommend, if you're having issues understanding anything, then circling with either a consultant or perhaps your legal team, just to make sure that you have a full understanding of everything that the NOFO will entail if you are awarded funds. And then requirements in and of themselves that the NOFO has, they might be complex or difficult. There might be a lack of procedures for grant administration. So some agencies are very good at providing links and just detailed procedures that are available and easy to follow, while other agencies, there might be inconsistent procedures. So you might be emailing the agency just to figure out what those procedures are and what will be expected of you. And then there may be inconsistent reporting demands. So during one grant, let's say you're even awarded 2 back-to-back grants, sometimes those reporting demands might change. And then, of course, grant and administration in and of itself is rather a stringent effort because those requirements are rather lengthy, and then there's a lot that goes into it. Another thing that we have noticed clients may experience is staffing issues. So, in terms of lack of experience in carrying out grant administration, when this occurs, we often recommend perhaps hiring a consultant or working with the awarding agency to receive further information. Or, of course, you might bring on an additional staff person that's qualified and has grant administration experience. Another thing that we have noticed tends to occur that makes grant administration difficult is the procedures. So those require detailed documentation. So keeping up with that, making sure that you maintain detailed documents that are constantly available. You're detailing everything that all the project activities day in and day out, and then also you're maintaining process controls, just making sure that everything that is carried out during that project period of performance is detailed. And actually, even right when you start, when you obligate the grant, everything post that period, that needs to be detailed. And then once you actually close out the project, you also want to maintain those records for a period of 3 years in case you get audited. So right here, we wanted to go through an example project where there were some issues that have led to significant delays, and the client is currently at risk of actually losing their funding. So this was a FEMA project, and they received funding for some equipment. They have a period of performance that they're required to meet, and they have obligated the grant. However, they have faced several issues that have resulted in a delay of actually the project activities being started. And as a result, that project period of performance, uh, even though as the clock started ticking, that means they have a shorter and shorter period of time to actually complete all the project activities, despite the fact that during the grant application itself, they stated that they would be able to complete all the activities within a year at the beginning of the start of the once the grant was obligated. So some things to go through, for example, that they have faced that you can avoid through preparation ahead of time are, for example, is procurement. They did not have a procurement policy in place, so they weren't ready to actually begin the procurement process once they obligated the grant, and then that has led to delays in identifying a contractor to from whom to actually purchase the equipment. Then there have been financing issues. So the agency, because most grants are reimbursement based, the agency has had issues in securing funding to actually front those costs. And then inadequate staffing means that the agency has had issues in actually finding staff people to actually carry out these things such as procurement, and then also coordinating with the awarding agency. And then this has led to schedule delays as well as growing costs. So over the next few slides, we will go through best practices and actually avoiding such things to make sure that you don't experience such issues, and then you don't actually have a clawback of funding, because if you have a clawback of funding, then that means your entire grant application itself was not worth it, because then you're not able to carry out the project.
Hannah, I just want to jump in here a second and make a note on staffing because you're absolutely right that we do see that as an issue with a lot of communities that just often don't have the staff capacity to manage so many grants. And I think we understand that there's often limitations to bring on more staff or bring support in other ways. But I do think through some of the things that we're able to communicate here that your organization can be successful in administering grants with the staff that you have. And it reminds me too of kind of some of the guidance that we shared earlier about preparing a grant earlier when we were in in-person sessions about really thinking of your team as an organization as larger than just yourself and making those connections among your organization, whether it's people in different roles and how they can support in delivering a grant application and getting data and all that sort of thing. And I think it's very similar here on the grant administration side. So I know many of you that we met in person have kind of, one person grant teams at your organization, but to the extent that you can, really plan and connect with folks in your finance office or other folks on the project side, that can really kind of, you know, expand your capacity to deliver these projects without, bringing on, new staff or consultants, because we know that's a challenge in a lot of places. So please don't think that, you can't administer these grants with one person. It can be a challenge. I think planning for that and really understanding who's on your team and in your corner can help to make these projects successful. I just wanted to share that. Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, to build, that's a really good point, Russell. And to build off of that, we recognize that some agencies may avoid actually completing all the pre-activities. Let's say if you received funding for construction, you might delay completing environmental work or design work until you actually receive that notice of award. But you basically you want to try to complete as many activities as you can that'll avoid delays from that time of the grant award to the time of obligating the grant, just because that time clock again is always rolling, and once that time clock runs out, that's it. And then just overall, we're going to be going through what happens after the award. So we're going to go through each stage, what will be required of your agency, what federal requirements you'll be expected to comply with. So there might be requirements for where you are allowed to purchase equipment from. There's also reporting requirements. And then how you should address changes to the scope, any changes in schedule, budget, staffing, who do you coordinate with? And then also, what are the elements of successful grant administration? So making sure that we give you the right tools to actually administer the grant on time and that you are able to avoid delays so that you receive all of the funding that you need. And then you might recognize this slide right here, but basically the grant administration phases that we will be going through in detail will be the post-award stage, implementation, closeout, and post-closeout. And we will be going through each of these sub-bullets in detail and making sure that, again, you have all the resources that you need. But the fine line here is that reporting requirements are a heavy lift, so you don't want to make the mistake of waiting to actually having everything ready at the end, just waiting to the last moment. You want to try to do everything day by day so that nothing builds up over time and you don't need additional hands, whether that means outreach with additional staff, as Russell mentioned, or just making sure that you, I don't know, purchase specific software, just anything that will help you prepare and keep detailed records, and then also meet all the other federal requirements that will be expected of you during the grant administration phase. So real quick, we're going to pause for a moment to see if anyone has any questions so far. And feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself.
Amy, I see your question here in the chat. If you'd like to come off mute, curious to hear your thoughts actually on how many grants you think one can manage at one time. It's a good question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Of course, you know, there are so many different kinds of grants. I mean, if you have a construction project, it's obviously a much bigger lift than, something that's a lot more simple. But there are so many nuances to every grant, and you have multiple types and multiple different levels of, compliance for each one. And I just, as a director of my department, I want to make sure that I'm not giving people because business development is something that we all have to do. Bringing in additional clients and doing more grant administration and helping our communities to get as much funding as they possibly can, particularly at the development district. When we're covering 13 counties, there are a lot of counties that want to get grant funding for their development projects. And, so I'm trying to figure out balancing bringing in more grants, writing more grants, with administering the ones that we have, and not overloading the staff so much that they're, more prone to, making errors or forgetting something. I think we have right now, I think 35 grants. With just a couple of people on staff. And so, just curious to see what you guys think about that.
Can I ask what organization are you with?
With the Greater Nashville Regional Council.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, you're spot on that all the grants are different, and, administering a construction project is definitely more involved, and federal grants are often more involved than state or other grants. So it really depends. I mean, 35 is a lot of grants. It's like anything, the more experience that you have with it and that your staff has with it, it can make things easier. But of course, there's a limit to everything. One of the things we emphasized in the workshops that we did in person was just the value of partnership, and as far as, strengthening projects. And I think it absolutely applies to this too, that working with more partners, getting them involved early in the process, it for one thing, it makes for a more competitive and successful grant oftentimes, to show funders that you have partners. And then on the flip side, once you get the funding to the extent, and I know it's not possible all the time, but I think to the extent it is possible, to really lean on some of your partners to help with these grant administration reporting requirements. That can help to lessen the load on your staff. So wondering, does that seem like an option for some of the grants you've secured? Or
I guess I'm curious to hear what you mean by partners. I mean, we have internal staff partners that we work with, for research and data, and sometimes other, other assistance with like Davis-Bacon compliance and things of that nature. But we don't work with a lot of external partners to administer our grants.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, you as the applicant are certainly on the hook to, sign on the dotted line and administer it. But what we've seen in other communities is, if there is a a partnership to implement a project, like maybe you're working with a nonprofit partner to deliver a project. I mean, ultimately, your organization as the applicant and as the entity that's receiving the funds is going to be responsible for the administration. But if there's a way to, ask your partners to help, complete some of the quarterly reporting, or, a lot of grant programs require some sort of monitoring to happen on an ongoing basis. That's something again that some of the communities we've worked with have been able to lean on their local partners to do some of that monitoring, and especially for projects that are benefiting them or that they had a part in delivering. So you're right.
I see what you're saying. I think, we are administrators, so we're not grantees. So, I mean, our partners are our grantees, and
I see. I see.
keeping them in line and making sure that they're moving forward in a way that keeps them on a timeline and all that. I mean, that's reporting and monitoring and all of those things. Requests for reimbursement, those are easy. To me, it's the hard part is, making sure the project is moving forward and us not being the project manager and the administrator. So, and then budget challenges and, revisions and amendments and changes that the grantor makes throughout the process. And, yeah, it's just some of them are easier than others. Some of them require a real heavy lift, particularly the Davis-Bacon stuff. But, I try to keep construction projects, for my staff, I try to keep those to a minimum. So, I don't have one person working on like 3 or 4 major construction projects.
Right. Yeah, well, that's interesting that you're kind of on both sides of it. You're a grantor and a grantee, right? At the same time, you're
No,
kind of
no. Well, no, we're just communities and other entities use our services for grant administration. So we're not,
I see.
we're like the middleman between the grantor and the grantee.
Okay.
But thank you for your insight. I appreciate it. And I don't want to take up a whole lot more time on that question.
No, thanks for your question. Maybe we'll call on you later today. You have a lot of experience that we can learn from. So thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, the other thing I just wanted to add to that is that I think that underscores it's also we recommend building in the budget for it within the budget, so the staff time or the consultant or whoever is going to be doing the grant administration, building in sufficient time for that, just so that you don't have to bear that cost on your end during the project period of performance.
Okay. So this section here is on preparing to receive funding. And so these are steps you can take, I think best practices, and also some requirements that it's important to be aware of before you receive your grant award. So if you can go to the next slide. So the first thing here is actually a step that you're going to take before you even submit your grant application, which is to complete some required registrations. If you are submitting a federal grant application, it's very likely that you'll be submitting through grants.gov. And so you'll want to make sure that you're registered in the grants.gov system to be able to submit your application package. If you are applying for federal funding, you will also want to be registered in SAM.gov, which is the official system for doing business with the federal government. It is a requirement to be registered in SAM.gov to directly apply for federal assistance. And so when you register in SAM.gov, you'll receive what's called your unique entity identifier, your UEI, which is a 12-character identifier. It's used by a number of federal government systems as a way of identifying unique entities. And And so to receive federal funding, if you are the direct recipient, you will need to be registered in SAM.gov and have a UEI. If you are expecting to be a sub-recipient of funding, so not the lead applicant on an application, but to receive funding through some kind of pass-through entity or a sub-award, you don't necessarily need to be registered in SAM.gov, but you do need to have your own UEI number for your organization. And so a federal award is contingent upon having an active SAM.gov registration. So this is something that once you have it does need to be renewed on, I think, an annual basis. And so maybe your organization has had one for a very long time, but it's still important to verify that it is an active registration. And as an awardee, it will be your responsibility to continue to maintain that active registration with current information at the time of applying, also when your application is under review by the awarding agency, and during your active federal award. So as you're executing your grant award that you've won, you'll need to make sure that your registration is renewed on an annual basis and remains active in order to stay in compliance. And just a tip here, it does take quite a bit of time, so it can take a month or more to complete the registrations. And so just as a best practice, it's good not to wait until the application deadline to submit these registrations if you haven't done them before. They take a bit of time. If you get up to your deadline and you don't have them, then you will be ineligible to apply for that grant. So next slide, please. So some administrative regulations to be aware of. I think the biggest one that we want to highlight here is the 2 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200. This is officially called the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards, or Uniform Guidance is, I think, what it's commonly known as. And these are the regulations that govern all federal grants and cooperative agreements issued by the federal government to non-federal entities. And so it is very jargony. If you don't have your law degree, it may not be the most fun read. So it's not something that you necessarily need to commit to memory, but it is a very important set of legislation and regulations that will govern any federal award that you receive. And so we have pulled out, we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides some of these. So financial management requirements are highlighted there, internal controls, requirements for pass-through entities. These are all things that you should be aware of if you are going to receive federal funding and execute a federal grant. You'll want to make sure that you're aware of the requirements that are listed in the uniform guidance that you will need to comply with. And so the uniform guidance is intended to strengthen oversight of federal funds to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse. I think it's also intended to reduce the administrative burden on awardees who are managing federal funding. And so in addition to the uniform guidance, we also wanted to just note that some grant programs may have their own specific program terms and conditions that you'll have to follow in addition to the uniform guidance. These may be determined by certain legislation that authorizes a grant program. So just an example of that is for FEMA's hazard mitigation programs, the Stafford Act requires that states and local and tribal governments have developed and adopted a hazard mitigation plan by the time an applicant submits their application and at the time of funding obligation in order to be eligible for certain FEMA hazard mitigation grants. So that's just an example of a program term and condition that you would need to be in compliance with in order to receive funding through a FEMA hazard mitigation grants. Next slide, please. And so in order to set yourself up for success to be in compliance and to effectively manage your federal award, internal controls and financial management systems and processes are a very important thing to have in place before you receive your award. Hopefully this is something that your organizations or your agencies already have written down and have in place. But if not, you'll want to have these established well before you apply for any kind of funding. So financial management is a very important part of grant administration, and can help you accurately manage your federal award. And so you'll want to have your accounts receivable in order before you get your award. If you don't have these systems in place, it can be a big problem. And so you want to make sure when you get your funding that you have the right account set up and you have someone on your team who can administer those funds. And so there isn't necessarily I think a one size fits all approach to financial management. I think it very much is organization dependent. You can use certain softwares that are out there, like QuickBooks is one. I think maybe even like Workday or Salesforce or other types of softwares that you could use. Whatever you do decide to use for your organization, just make sure it's user friendly and not something that's going to be a huge burden to learn how to use, because that'll make it less effective when you ultimately go to manage your award. And so financial management, whatever you do decide to use, it does need to comply with certain uniform guidance requirements. So it does need to be able to identify and organize all of the awards your organization has received, maintain accurate records, compare your budgeted expenditures versus actuals, and then be able to document any written policies and procedures for your organization. And so another thing to highlight here is just monitoring of subrecipients. So having written policies and procedures in place for subrecipients is important. I think Russell mentioned earlier, having your subrecipients be able to contribute to the performance reports and financial reports that you're going to have to submit on a quarterly basis. You're going to want to make sure that you have those processes in place before you receive your award, so that your organization and your partners, your subrecipients, are well aware of what they need to be able to comply with for the grant terms. It's also important to have a plan in place for any subrecipients who maybe haven't been part of a grant award before, or maybe haven't received federal funding before. That can always be a little bit of a riskier thing, just if they've never done it before. And so it's important to think early on how you'll go about handling those challenges before you find yourself in that challenging situation. And so another important thing to highlight here is internal controls. And so we have just here on the right side of the screen, internal control best practices. So things like having adequate staff. Like we said earlier, that doesn't necessarily mean going out and hiring a bunch of people or hiring consultants if you're not able to do that, but looking within your teams and your organization to find staff who can both execute the projects as well as the grant. So looking to your grant teams, your technical teams, your finance teams to have adequate staff in place to be able to administer the grants. Another part of that is separation of duties. So that's a very important internal control best practice, and it just helps prevent errors and fraud. So separating responsibilities for critical tasks amongst various people on your team instead of having just one person do it all. Another thing, like I said before, is just written policies and procedures in place. And so staff are aware of what the compliance requirements are and how to follow them. And then you'll probably hear me harp on this throughout this entire session, but keeping detailed and organized records. You really want to document everything when it comes to grant administration. Keep your files digital. If you're able to do that, have them in some kind of cloud storage, have standard naming conventions, keep everything organized. It's really going to do your future self a favor to make sure that you have everything organized and in a central location, and it'll just make your reporting and any potential audits that you face so much easier. Next slide, please. Okay, so other federal requirements, in addition to those that might be program specific, in addition to the uniform guidance that dictates any kind of federal funding, there are other federal requirements that you should be aware of because you may have to comply with them for certain types of projects that you're receiving funding for. So some of these I think we're going to go into a little bit more detail in the next few slides, like environmental review and procurement. But just to highlight some of the things that you see here in this list, Build America, Buy America, also known as BABA, is one thing that you may be required to comply with for certain public infrastructure projects. And so that says that materials like iron and steel and other construction materials have to be manufactured in the United States for certain types of projects. And so that is something that you would need to comply with. And if you can't comply, there is kind of an involved waiver process that would have to be filled out. And so if you don't fill out the waiver or can't fill out the waiver and you can't comply, then it's very likely that your funding would be revoked if you don't follow Build America, Buy America. Another one here that was mentioned earlier is Davis-Bacon. So the Davis-Bacon Act requires that contractors and subcontractors pay prevailing wages. And so if you hire contractors to complete your federally funded projects, they will need to comply with Davis-Bacon. So that's something that you can demonstrate by submitting a statement of compliance. They'll have to submit very likely certified payroll reports. And so if you do have contractors on your team who are going to help execute your project, it's important just to have that open communication with them and make sure that they understand the reporting requirements and the timelines that they're ultimately going to have to comply with as well. Another one on here to mention is signage. So usually there's a requirement for public signage for construction projects that are federally funded to inform the public of the project and just increase transparency in how it was funded. And so I think historically there have been federal guidelines, kind of like a style guide for how the signage should look, where it should be placed, what it should say. And then typically I think every funding agency also has some variation of requirements for signage. So it may have something like their logo on it. But that is a requirement, I think, for certain construction projects that are over, I'm not entirely sure what the dollar value is, but over a certain dollar value, we'll need to have some form of signage included. And that's something that if your project falls into the category where that would be required, it's something that you could probably write into your budget for the projects. And then I think the last one to highlight here is cost effectiveness. And so if you are receiving federal funding, you will want to demonstrate that the project is worth the public investment in federal dollars. And so you'll want to demonstrate that the benefits of the project outweigh the costs. And so many grant programs like FEMA programs and DOT programs will require some kind of benefit cost analysis to be submitted as part of the application. And so that's where you'll go about quantifying the project's benefits and demonstrating the cost effectiveness of the projects. Okay, next slide, please. So just to dive a little deeper into environmental review, federal agencies are required to evaluate the potential environmental effects of a proposed federal action. And so this is something that requires a lot of coordination with other federal agencies, local agencies, state agencies to make sure the project complies with any kind of environmental regulations and requirements. And so many federal grant programs, especially for any that are funding groundbreaking activities and construction, will require environmental review to be completed before funding can be obligated, because the federal agency does ultimately have to demonstrate NEPA compliance, so the National Environmental Policy Act compliance. And there are typically 3 classes of action to determine environmental review. So class 1 is an environmental impact statement, and that's for actions that do significantly impact the environment or are expected to impact the environment. Class 2 is a categorical exclusion, or a CADX, is applicable for projects that don't have a significant effect on the environment. And then class 3 is environmental assessment, and it's required where it's not clear what the environmental impacts may be. And so a class 3 assessment, I think, will ultimately lead to either an environmental impact statement needing to be developed or a finding of no significant impacts. Next slide, please. And so this is just to highlight that some agencies have a little bit of different processes for complying with NEPA. And so this is an example for FEMA applications for FEMA funded projects. Under NEPA, FEMA is required to consider the impacts of FEMA funded actions on the environment. And so FEMA starts considering any kind of environmental actions very early on in the project development, just so that it's easier to know about any kind of compliance issues or any kind of impacts early on, which just leads to more efficiency and more successful hazard mitigation projects. And so for many FEMA grants, including the BRIC program and some HMGP and flood mitigation assistance, they'll require you to submit this information as part of the application package. And so it's going to include things like a very detailed description of the project footprints, and any kind of groundbreaking activities that might happen, a description of impacts to habitats and vegetation and wetlands and floodplains in the project area, any kind of impacts to national historic structures or structures older than 50 years within the project area. And then for anything that your project does affect, you will need to provide some kind of supporting documentation. So things like color photographs of the project site, maps, a floodplain map, things like that will need to be included so that FEMA can complete this environmental and historic preservation review before any funding can be obligated. Next slide, please. And so when we talk about grant obligation, obligation occurs when a selected applicant and the funding agency enter into a written agreement after the applicant has satisfied any kind of administrative requirements. So if there's any kind of required planning that needs to be completed or environmental review requirements for construction projects, that all has to be satisfied before any funding can be obligated. All grant expenses do have to be obligated by the end of the project period. And any non-expended funds that aren't obligated will ultimately revert back to the awarding agency. And so you don't want that to happen for your projects. So it's just important to be aware. I think that a lot of programs, like for example, some DOT grant programs have an obligation deadline that funding has to be obligated by. And just kind of a reminder that grant timelines are an important thing to consider. All grants have different timelines. Some are very quick for a review of your application and for funding to be obligated, and some are a lot slower. And so depending on what your project is and your project's timeline, you really want to make sure that your project timeline aligns with the grant timeline, because you ultimately don't want to have to pause a project unnecessarily for a grant that might be a little bit slower and take more time. And you also don't want to try to speed up your project to fit within a grant timeline that isn't realistic for what you're proposing to do. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights just some procurement requirements to be aware of. And so applicants who are seeking federal funding do need to follow both federal procurement standards as well as any applicable local or state procurement laws. If those don't necessarily align, then you'll want to follow whatever the most stringent requirements are. And for any kind of procurement you do with federal dollars, you want to make sure that you detail that documentation of the procurement method, the selection process, the basis for the contract prices, because you will need to demonstrate that procurement has been done in a competitive and a fair process. And so generally speaking, in most cases, procurement does need to be competitive. There are certain circumstances where sole source procurement is applicable. Those are pretty limited. Some examples of where that may be more appropriate is if services don't exceed the micro purchase threshold of $50,000. If the service that you're procuring is only available from one source, if there's an emergency, if your funding agency expressly authorizes that you may do sole source procurement, that's something that you would need to request in writing and get their response in writing. And then if competition is determined to be an inadequate way of procuring whatever it is that you're trying to procure. But generally speaking, assume that it has to be competitive unless you receive authorization otherwise. Next slide, please. And so here we're getting into you've submitted your grant application, you found out that you were selected, you've complied with all of the other federal requirements that you need to comply with. And so you're ready to execute your grant agreement, which is the official issuance of your grant award. And so the grant agreement will include a couple things. It'll include an assigned grant number, which is unique to your grant, and it's going to be used across all of your grant documents that you have with your funding agency. So it's just important. We were talking before about kind of standard naming conventions. That's something to make sure that you log and use consistently across anything related to this grant. It's also going to include information on your projects, your budget, any cost share requirements that you may have, your project period. It is important to very thoroughly review and read the grant agreement. You'll probably have a very specific amount of time in which you can read it and ultimately accept it. This is a period that can be a little bit of a negotiation between you and the funding agency because it is likely that when they reviewed your application, they may have made changes to your scope, they may have made changes to your budget, and so you'll want to review and you'll want to make sure that you understand if any changes have been made to what you have proposed, and you want to make sure that you understand any terms that they have set that you must comply with that may be on top of any of the other specific terms and conditions related to your projects. And so the grant agreement can be accepted either by signing it, which I think is the standard way, or if you start drawing down funds. When you do accept the grant agreement, it is a legally binding agreement. And so you are obligated to carry out all of the terms and conditions within that grant agreement. So another reason why it's important to read it and fully understand what you need to comply with. Next slide, please.
Ellen, do
Yep.
you mind if I just chime in for a second?
Yeah.
It's 3:15, so if you wanted to take a stretch break or if you're on a roll, we could do it in a couple slides, but I think it was a while away still.
Yep. I think we've got a break right after this slide. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. I'll fly through this and then we can maybe take a break. So just this final slide here in this section is kicking off your projects. And so once you accept the grant award, it's a good idea to have an official kickoff meeting. So that's something that maybe your grant officer would be invited to, the person from your funding agency who's your main point of contact. That's something that your project team would be a part of if you have any sub-recipients, or any partners who are going to help execute your project, your grant staff, you'll want to make sure that they are all part of that kickoff conversation where you can really establish roles and responsibilities for everyone on your team and also set clear expectations for any kind of performance monitoring or measures so that everyone understands the terms and conditions of the grants. This is also an opportunity where, in the spirit of documenting everything, you'll want to create a project file. So a central location where you can store anything related to this grant. FEMA has a template. I think when the slides are sent out, you'll maybe have access to this link here. But FEMA has a template for a project file in OneNote, which may be helpful for some of you. You don't have to use it or have to necessarily use OneNote. You can use whatever system works best for you and for your organization, but you do just want to make sure to keep things organized, restrict access to people who need it, and then also kind of a best practice to have everything related to your grant tied to some kind of generic email address. So not necessarily your personal, or not personal, but your work email address, so that if you switch roles or if somebody else takes over administering this grant, it'll be tied to an email address that someone else could have access to and not necessarily your work email address. So just another best practice to highlight. And I think that's it for that slide. So if you want to. Okay.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Ellen. So yeah, we'll just take about 5 minutes here. We'll reconvene at 20 minutes after the hour. Might be 4 minutes, but just give everybody a chance to catch their breath, take a break, and we'll be right back for the second half here. So thanks, everyone. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started and dive into the next kind of section we have here on project and grant execution. And Anna will lead us through this this discussion. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Russell. So we're going to be diving into the grant implementation stage, which entails the following activities. So it basically involves onboarding of the consultant or the contractor, as well as project initiation, agency division coordination, which is going to be occurring throughout the entire grant lifecycle following the grant award stage. And then, of course, grant agreement amendments, if you need any to be done. And those will occur if there's any changes to scope or such. And then, as well as the reporting frequency and then invoicing. So during the onboarding stage, you're going to be required prior to beginning the actual activities that you will be expected to that you expect to receive reimbursement for. You want to make sure that you have completed all the pre-expenditure requirements. Just to make sure that you're able to start on all the activities quite rapidly. So as mentioned earlier, if you when you receive that notice of funding award, you want to rapidly start completing any activities that will be complete prior that need to be completed prior to all the activities for which you will expect to receive reimbursement for. And optimally, you will complete all of these activities prior to actually obligating the grant, and this will save you time as well as help you make sure that you're able to complete your activities within your project period of performance. The next thing you want to do is identify your overall project manager who will, depending on the size of the project, they'll either assist you with the document, completing all the documentation that's required, or they will, of course, hire additional staff or identify the responsible individuals within, let's say, the accounting department or such that will be completing those activities. And then you want to, during this stage, you also want to understand all the grant terms. So you want to communicate these grant terms with the your agency staff as well as the consultants and contractors. So you'll likely want to have a meeting where you go over all of these requirements and make sure that these are readily available just to make sure that everyone is consistently in compliance. Something that I once saw one agency do, which I would recommend, is they basically were provided with all of the requirements for the grant from the awarding agency. And then they basically made a spreadsheet identifying A, how they were in compliance with those requirements, or B, they things that they would need to work on when they actually started carrying out those activities. And then this will also help you make sure that, again, all the activities that are carried out, as well as um, uh, the things that you are seeking reimbursement for, that they will be in compliance with the grant itself. And then the other thing is that during the grant obligation stage, right, you set the project schedule and the project budget, and you want to make sure that you're able to consistently adhere to the schedule and the budget that you have set. If you're not able to adhere to those, then that will require additional coordination with your awarding agency, as well as potential grant amendments. So diving in a little deeper into that agency coordination, which is one of the most important things to make sure that you're in good communication with the agency is A, establishing the preferred method of communication, whether your assigned contact prefers emails, Teams. Something that we would recommend is potentially setting up routine meetings with that individual just to make sure that everything is up to date, and also that you are satisfying all of their demands and that there's nothing that falls through the cracks. So this may be like a 30-minute monthly meeting or a bi-weekly meeting, just something to make sure that you have an open line of contact. And then you also, when you're awarded the contract and when you sign that grant agreement, that you also want to develop a preliminary list of questions that you might want to ask the awarding agency, just anything that comes to mind. That way you're able to clear those questions out ahead of time before you actually start carrying out project activities. And then the other thing is you want to understand all the requirements, so all the forms that you're required to complete. And if there's any questions in terms of the requirements, you'll want to communicate with the agency and ask those questions ahead of time. So during the implementation stage, coordination is extremely important. Coordination with everyone that you are working with. So be it the contractor, the consultant, the awarding agency, you want to make sure that you have detailed records of everything that occurs. So be it daily records or weekly records, you want to maintain detailed records of everything that occurs and upload those into a system, be it SharePoint, be it whichever system you choose. But having these detailed records will help you avoid issues later on because you might forget what occurred, or you might be requested to identify or explain something. And if you have those detailed records, then you can just refer to those, and then that saves you time and effort. And then also it backs up everything that you expended funds on. And then this will also assist you with progress monitoring. So completing those quarterly progress reports. And for those, you should also, for example, for construction projects, you will want to do site visits, desk reviews, just again, maintaining records of everything and helping you actually provide proof of everything that occurs. So during the implementation stage, you will be expected to complete progress reports. These progress reports will consist of a description of activities that have been completed. They'll include progress updates, percentage of work completed, and then in terms of costs, you'll want to detail any overruns or underruns, any challenges or delays. If you do experience those, you want to have a detailed explanation of why those things are occurring. So justification, and then if you are at risk of your project schedule timeline, you want to identify this problem early on and circle with the awarding agency if you potentially will need a time extension because that project period of performance, it may be flexible to an extent, but again, you don't want to be there with the last month with the last month remaining and then scrambling. You want to identify these issues early on to see if there's room for error and what can be done to give you more time if needed. So for implementation, you'll be during the implementation stage, you'll be required to also complete financial reports. These are typically the SF425 form, which we'll show on a later slide. That'll detail the costs of activities that occurred. It'll also state the status of funds, and then you'll also need to be including reimbursement requests with supporting documentation. So right here, we have an example of a form that you might need to complete, such as the SF-270, which is an advanced reimbursement request form. This form, typically, an agency won't allow you to advance reimbursement. However, there are exceptions, so you'll want to work with the awarding agency in case you do need this, but this is basically how the form would look like. Here's the SF-271, which is the reimbursement request form. So see, it's a line-by-line item breakout of your costs. And again, if you have any questions, of course, work with experts or your awarding agency officer who will help you fill out these costs and itemize. This is the SF-425 form that was previously mentioned. Typically, you'll also include that progress report with details about which activities were carried out, all the documentation, receipts, such things. And then another thing to cover is grant agreement amendments. So these amendments, they need to be submitted to the grant officer which you are assigned. They have to always be consistent with the grant guidelines, and you will complete grant agreement amendments when there's changes, any significant changes. So be it in scope, budget, project site, just anything that it makes a significant change to the project. If you're unsure if you need to proceed with a grant agreement, you want to work with your grant officer and ask those questions. And then, of course, they're not always going to be approved, but to help you make sure that it is approved, you want to work with the grant officer and understand those questions that will be asked and make sure that you're in compliance. So reporting in and of itself, this will vary by the grant and also the agency. Sometimes typically you'll be required to complete quarterly reports and annual reports. Sometimes they're more frequent, monthly or biweekly. We would actually recommend setting up a process internally where you're completing everything biweekly just to help you keep on track and making sure that you have all the sufficient documents ready to go when the actual federal report deadline hits. And then you want to make sure that you understand the system that you're working with and the systems where you will be required to submit these reports. So again, these vary by agency. For example, FEMA uses ND grants and PARS. You might be required to use Delphi for USDOT. So there's a variety of systems and they're all a bit different. So ahead of time when you actually, again, receive that funding award and you know who your agency officer is, you want to work with them to help you understand any of the kinks with the system. That way you avoid having to troubleshoot later on. And then for the reporting itself, you want to identify significant accomplishments, any issues that you have, and then also identify milestone activities and then upcoming activities. So for invoicing, you'll typically be required to complete the SF-271 as well as an invoice summary spreadsheet, and then all the supporting documentation, so receipts, all these items. And again, we recommend maintaining these receipts and all the documentation in a digital record that's easily accessible to several people at your agency or the consultant, whoever you're working with that will be responsible for completing and submitting these reimbursement requests. And then the other thing to note is, again, these requirements will vary by agency, so you want to make sure that you understand that specific agency's requirement for the specific grant that you are working on. So key takeaways here for the past few slides is that you want to understand that every grant and agency is unique, as well as your awarding agency officer contact. So when you receive that grant award and you obligate, you want to make sure that you understand everything and then you develop a system to meet those requirements. So that entails developing a tailored approach that works for your agency, as well as understanding whether you want to do things internally or outsourcing. But regardless of the approach you choose, you want to make sure that you're able to deliver and submit everything on time, as there's deadlines to complete all of these activities. If you are unable to complete activities within the specified timelines, you need to remember that this will look later on poorly on your agency, as well as it'll delay actually receiving funding for which you're seeking reimbursement. So any questions regarding those past slides? If not, I will pass it on to Ellen to go over grant closeout and audits.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Can you go to the next slide? So when you have completed your project to officially close out your grant award, the awarding agency does have to confirm that the recipient has completed all of the required grant work and all of the administrative tasks. And so until you receive this confirmation, your grant is still active and you do still have to comply with all of the terms and conditions. Closeout is the process that the grantor or the funding agency uses to determine the recipient has completed all of the technical work, as well as all of the applicable financial requirements. And so the closeout process does take several months. And if you go to the next slide. So before your grant term officially ends, you'll likely receive a closeout letter from your funding agency. I think it's typically 90 days, 60 days, something like that before your grant agreement expires, and it may vary by funding agency. The closeout letter will explain all of the requirements that you will need to follow to officially close out your grant award. Grants do need to be closed out within 120 days of the end of the period of performance for the projects. Going back to that uniform guidance, there are very specific procedures outlined in the uniform guidance of how closeout is to be done. And certain agencies like FEMA, for example, have closeout checklists like the one shown in the image on the slide. So it's important to fully understand the requirements of closeout and what actions your organization does need to take to properly close out your grants. And this is where all of those detailed records that you've been keeping in your very organized files are going to really come into play. You will need to reconcile any indirect costs and ensure that these costs weren't charged above the approved rate. You'll need to confirm that you have met all of your cost share requirements. You'll need to document all of your expenditures and confirm that they were made within the allowable period of performance. And any income, program income that was earned is going to need to be reported during the closeout process. And so if you go to the next slide. So similar to your quarterly progress reports and quarterly financial reports, you will also need to submit a final financial and progress report. And so this is going to have to be submitted for the recipient, as well as any subrecipients who may have received part of the funding award. And so subrecipients, I think, will typically submit to the recipient no later than 90 days after the period of performance ends. And then the recipient generally has about 120 days after the period of performance and to submit any final financial and progress reports to their funding agency. And so this will be the SF425 form that Anna discussed. It'll also be a final progress report of your project. And so that will need to include a description of your project and any deviations that you had from your expected work plan. It'll also need to include a comparison of your anticipated project outcomes versus actual outcomes. You'll need to explain your project accomplishments as well as any that weren't met and why. And then the project officer or your grant officer will review the reports and ensure that they're complete. This is also the time during closeout to liquidate any obligations. So pay your contractors and your vendors. That will also need to be completed within the 120 days. Next slide, please. And so post closeout, once you have officially closed out your grant agreement, you're probably thinking that's the time you can delete your project files and shred all your records, right? Wrong. You will need to retain all of your records for 3 years from the date that you submitted your final financial reports. So all of that supporting documentation, all of your invoices and just any other records that you kept about your project will have to be retained throughout your grant term, as well as after. You may be subject to audits. And so that's part of the reason why it's very important to hang on to your records. Any non-federal entity that expends, I think it's $1 million or more of federal funding in a fiscal year is subject to an audit for that year. And so that applies to both direct recipients as well as subrecipients. You can also be audited after your grant closeout. And so again, just very important to continue to hang on to those records and make sure you have all of your files. And next slide. So this final section here is takeaways, as well as just reiterating some of the best practices for grant administration. After this section, we'll get into Q&A in the time that we have left. So if you can go to the next slide. So just to recap what to do when you win a grant, make sure you have your project plan that aligns with your budget and your schedule. Make sure that timeline for your project aligns with the grant timeline. Make sure you have someone on your project team who can read and understand all of the materials from your funding agency. A lot of funding agencies also have resources online, like grant administration trainings for awardees. And so working with your grant officer to make sure you can access any forms of technical assistance they may have for you if you are a funding recipient. Just a reminder not to spend the funding on anything that hasn't been agreed to in your budget. And so again, funding agencies may modify your budget before they issue your grant agreement. And so just don't spend money on anything that hasn't been agreed upon in writing with your grant officer. And again, document everything, keep your digital records, organize everything in one place is a best practice. And so next slide. So lessons learned. We heard from someone in one of our in-person sessions who was saying that I think it was something like 5 years after grant closeout still was required to submit annual reports on the projects that had been awarded funding. And so funding agencies do want to stay updated on your project's performance well after grant closeout. So they want to see not only how the money was used to execute the project, but also how the project is sustaining benefits over the long term. And so it's just important to recognize that once you do close out your grant award, that may not necessarily be the end of it. It's also hopefully not the last grant award that you will win. And so identifying lessons learned as you go through the grant process is important just to improve the process for next time. And so you can become more seasoned at managing grants if it's something that maybe you haven't done before, or you consider yourself a novice at grant administration. Another thing is just not to sound too cliche, but we are all in this together. And so using your networks, identifying people within your organization, finding people who are here in this digital session learning with you, who maybe have successfully managed awards in the past, and ask them how they did it, and ask them what worked and what didn't, and try to learn from the people in your network. Because grant administration is not necessarily intuitive. It is a very heavy lift. And so learning from people who are seasoned, who maybe have their own lessons learned that they can share with you, that's a good best practice to take into grant administration. Next slide, please. And so elements of successful grant management and grant administration, this is also just kind of a recap of what we've discussed in this session today. Having staff on your team who can understand the requirements, so people who can execute the projects, but people who can also administer the grant, accountants who can manage the finances, project managers who can coordinate with the grant officer. Having all of those people on your team to execute the grant will ensure that it can be done successfully. Coordination with other projects that you're delivering, just to make sure that your priorities from one project aren't canceling out priorities from another project. The ability to meet those federal grant requirements that we highlighted. So environmental review, the BABA requirements, prevailing wages, procurement, understanding what those are and what you are going to be held accountable to complying with. And then also just keeping your local electeds, your public, your partners informed on your project's progress, especially anybody who maybe supplied a letter of support for your application and really advocated for your project to get funding. So just keeping your community informed on your project and its successes and its benefits. And this can be done sometimes through lobbying, or also just through maintaining a website, public signage like we talked about before, or just having other forms of public information on your projects. And next slide, please. Okay, just to end here, these are just a couple resources for grant management and grant administration assistance. Again, when these slides are shared out, you should be able to access these links directly. Like I said before, many funding agencies do have some form of technical assistance that they offer. I think in addition to FEMA, EPA, DOT all have various forms of training for grant awardees. TEMA also has a grant management webpage and some other resources. There's also other local resources to Tennessee for grant management, as well as the FEMA management webpage that's linked there. But there are also private companies and other organizations that offer forms of technical assistance or training if you want to learn more about grant management. And so just a quick online search will probably yield a number of results if that's something that you want to dive deeper into beyond just this digital session. Okay, next slide I think is question and answer.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Thanks, Anna. So yeah, we've come to the end of our formal presentation here, and we've got about 12 minutes left in this session. As we've described throughout, we will be sharing these slides, and you're welcome to reach out to us individually with questions that come to mind later, but would welcome, yeah, any questions now. And so I'm seeing one from Amanda here. Thanks for this question, Amanda. Let me read this. Yeah, and Amanda, are you able to come off mute? I just want to make sure I understand your question. So you're sort of new to, you haven't pursued or received a grant just yet, is that right? I don't know if you're able to.
Oh, here you go. So I represent, as I said, Farmers Veterans Coalition, and we're looking at expanding where we apply for grants at and how to utilize our vast network of farmers. And so that's why I registered for these classes, because I actually used to work at the Joint Operations Center and work closely with TEMA. So I said, well, let me go to these classes to see how we can best serve FEMA, and what kind of grants that we can get, or how can we mobilize our entire farmers network during disasters. And I can't, for the life of me, authorize the question.
No problem. Okay.
Like we have, so for instance, so the Veterans Farmer Coalition is the largest coalition of veteran farmers across the entire United States. We have chapters in almost every state, but even if we don't have a full chapter, we have members in every state, including Hawaii. So we're just trying to figure out how to utilize that huge mobilization of farmers with equipment, storage, resources to help FEMA during disasters.
I see. Yeah, that's really interesting, and it sounds like really important work. It strikes me, I'm not positive that a grant, that your organization would be best to pursue a grant to deliver on that work. I think that might be sort of a different relationship with FEMA or TEMA to help during disasters, because most of the post-disaster grant programs like the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program or the Public Assistance Grant Program are really targeted towards immediate clearing of debris and rebuilding and things like that. And it sounds like your organization, could play a role in post-disaster support, but you probably, the grants move a little bit slow. And so I have a few ideas of maybe connect you with some of our FEMA colleagues to see if there might be some other avenues to get your organization engaged.
That would be amazing, because like I said, we have this huge resource of contacts. We have this huge resource of farmers in every, I guarantee you, we have a farmer in every region of the entire United States as a member. And like I said, we're just branching out to see different ways outside of what we normally do. So we're just trying to find different ways that we can help and to branch out our nonprofit, our organization.
Okay, yeah, no, that's really neat, and always good to think outside the box and see what opportunities are out there. So yeah, let me follow up. We'll have your email from the registration, and we can we'll follow up with you. But thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the group? You're welcome to raise your hand or put anything else in the chat. While we wait and see if there's some more questions that come in, I know we had a few good ones that came in on the Mentimeter earlier in this meeting, and I think we've covered a lot of these challenges and questions that people had around things like tracking deliverables, closeout, budget. I'm looking through these questions here. I think we covered most of them. One that I'm seeing that I can try to address here is this question on what happens if you go over in one budget area but under in another. And if the person who asked that wants to elaborate, feel free to chime in here. But I think I understand that issue, and so and there's a few thoughts on that. So I think what the issue is with many grant programs or grant applications and programs, you're kind of asked to be detailed about your budget and say, okay, well, here's my various line items. And it's always a bit of a balancing act when you're developing your application, because you want to be detailed enough to demonstrate to FEMA, TEMA, or the funding agency that your budget is well thought out, and you're not just putting in one cost to reconstruct a home that doesn't have any line items or sub costs. So you might break that out for, maybe there's a debris removal phase, a design phase, raw materials for the construction, and then the labor for the construction might be an easy way to break it out. So we always encourage people to be detailed with your budget, but not too detailed, because for this reason. So sometimes when your grant becomes awarded, then you have a budget that has to tie back to those specific line items that you articulated in your application, and you don't want to have too many categories, because you do often might go under or over in certain areas. And I hate to, I can't give a definitive answer to this question, but what I would say is that most funders we've worked with are generally willing to work with you if you go over budget in one area, and you can preserve some funding in a different area to cover that. It really depends, and there's often not a clear guidance on that type of thing. But if the overage is not tremendous, then it's usually going to be okay. And so what I would recommend is just some direct communication with your funder on that, or your representative from the granting agency, and see if you can work something out. I think what's more important is that the overall project stays within budget, because as we've emphasized in other sessions, it's very, very unlikely that you'll be able to kind of go back to the funder and ask for more money because your project is going over budget. But kind of staying within that ceiling, most funders are understanding of issues and kind of willing to move some funding from task 1 to task 2, or whatever it might be. It's a good question. Okay. Well, great. I'm not seeing any other questions that we haven't hit on in the Mentimeter, and I'm glad. Thanks, Desiree, for this link for Amanda. That's exactly the type of thing I had in mind there, so that's fantastic. Well, gee, we're already up here just a few more minutes in our allotted time, so I'm glad we were able to fill our session with some great content and great questions from the group. We'll stick around here for a few more minutes until the top of the hour. If there's any questions or people want to ask anything individual, we'll stick around. But if not, thank you again for joining today's workshop. We hope that it was valuable. We will be sending out the slides along with some additional survey questions that you're welcome to complete, and as well as the recording, as Melanie noted. And thank you as well for those of you who joined us in previous in-person sessions and other digital sessions. It's been a really, really valuable series, and it was delightful to kind of connect with many of you and hear about your challenges and the important work that you're trying to do for your communities, and hope that we were able to help provide some tips and tricks and strategies to make it even more successful as you go forward with your grant efforts in the future. So thanks again. And yeah, hope everyone has a great rest of the day, rest of the week, and we'll look forward to connecting you when we send out the slides and the presentation. So thanks.
And with that.